important note. Somehow I was unmuted and now I can hear myself. Yeah, there we go. The just really important note at the bottom. This is initial analysis. We probably need to do a little bit more vetting to make sure all the numbers compare with our counterparts at DEEP and the utilities, but at least wanted to provide you our initial assessment today for some context. Great. And then the last slide for me is I wanted to flag for all of you. Hopefully you're familiar with and are aware of our annual clean energy report. This year is our third installment of that report. It includes the programs that are funded, at least in part, by ratepayer funds and thus in some way related to PURA. And if you are looking for that report, you can find it annually in a docket that is numbered for the year. So in last year's report is in 23 and then 08, 01. And with that, I will turn it over to the chair.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And we just have 2 more slides and happy to open it up for questions. I did want to take a moment to focus on the annual review process. So all of the programs that we've stood up and talked about today, plus the programs that PURA has stood up under our grid modernization umbrella, which include our light duty electric vehicle charging program, our energy storage solutions program, and more. All of these programs are designed to be iterative. So by that, I mean, we have an annual docket each year. For those less familiar with PURA, a docket refers to an investigation, a proceeding. It's how we categorize our and keep track of the work on a specific topic. We have an annual docket each year where we have stakeholders come before us, either virtually or sometimes in person. Those stakeholders can include the electric distribution companies. They include folks that you'll hear from today. They include DEEP, the Office of Consumer Counsel, and really anyone who wants to be heard on this matter. As I started out saying, there are, of course, several buckets. One bucket of things with respect to the program that PURA cannot change on our own, which reflects things in that bucket include the cap or the fact that we must use competitive auctions, things that are prescribed in statute. We would have to seek a legislative change from you. And the committee has been historically receptive to our feedback. You adopted our suggestions last session, which were folded into SB 7. And those were some of the changes Josh spoke to. There's, of course, another bucket of things with respect to the programs that are in our purview and that we can review and make changes to through this annual docket process. Like everything that PURA does, we can only make a change if the record reflects evidence that supports that change. And I say substantial evidence that supports that change. So we do try to encourage our stakeholders to, in the context of this, provide examples of how a change they're seeking would further one of the objectives that we've set out for the program. I will say this is always a delicate balance because, of course, when you make changes to a program on a yearly basis, then you're, of course, bumping up against concerns about changing the program too frequently. We've certainly heard feedback about like, hey, give us a second to catch up. So we're always making the judgment call between whether a change is needed to the program to further one of those objectives that we showed on the screen. So we wanted to provide information to anyone in the room who's not familiar with the work that has been done. We've hyperlinked the decisions that we have worked on for the past several years in RRES, NRES, and SCEF. We also have a lot of information about these programs on our website. And last, as Josh was alluding to just a moment ago, not only do we issue an annual clean and renewable energy report, but we also issue an annual report covering our work from the previous calendar year much more broadly. And for those interested, we are hosting a webinar next Friday, March 1st at 10 a.m. That's going to walk through the annual report and some of what you've heard today, specific to PURA's activities in 2023. So with that, Chair Steinberg, I will return the floor to you to answer any questions that the committee might have, and I'll offer my apologies in advance. Pira is expected at the Appropriations Committee shortly, so we will be leaving you, but we will, of course, watch back the presentations and feedback from the remainder of your informational session, and would invite any of you, as well as the panelists today and folks in the room, to please join us in the upcoming annual program review dockets with additional feedback. Chair Steinberg, please.
Thank you, Chair Gillette and Josh, for your presentation. I have a few questions. I don't know if anybody else does. With regard to the NRES program, you referenced selected projects. For everybody's benefit, can you give us a little sense of the criteria that relate to how projects are selected?
Sure, happy to. Essentially, so there are criteria, and some of which were included in my slides. So under 5 megawatts, and so there are certain thresholds, criteria. But then after that, it's purely selected on the cheapest bids.
And with regard to the caps, we may hear from those who present today some concern about what we might describe as stranded projects, projects that have been approved, but for a variety of reasons, and we've had any number of exogenous anomalies in recent years, haven't been built. Do we have a sense about how many projects are really not moving forward in that sense?
I can give a quick response and then, of course, pass it over to the chair. We anticipated that question and have do not currently today have that number for you. But there are a number of projects that weren't selected. I'm not sure as to the magnitude of the number of projects, but it is few. It's certainly fewer than the number of projects that were actually selected overall.
I would just add to that, and to be clear, whether the caps are binding or not is a question pertaining to the non-residential programs only. As our residential programs, we've designed to target a deployment of 50 to 60 megawatts per year, but as you've seen on the data on the slide, actually exceeded that by 4 times. So we would be happy to supplement our presentation once we're able to compile the data about the degree to which the caps were binding on the non-residential side. And I think you'll only see that bindingness in the larger competitive categories, as Josh showed on the slide, the low emissions and the zero emissions weren't fully subscribed. So the binding would come in the higher categories.
Great. One last question, and I'll see if anybody else has any. With reference to the SCIF program, first of all, it's very encouraging to see the overall solar installation numbers virtually double year to year, even if some of that was sort of carryover from the previous year. There are those, and you've described this as sort of our version of a community solar program. There are those who have looked at other states to say that they have broader community solar programs. Would we characterize our version as successful, particularly given where the prices are, or should we be beginning to consider other versions of community solar?
I think, and I'll turn it over to Josh for a fuller answer, but I want to be clear, the primary distinction, at the top level between SCIF and community solar is, of course, the types of renewable energy projects that qualify for the program. In the state of Connecticut, we consider fuel cells, for example, to be eligible facilities. So I do know that there is sometimes confusion between SCIF and community solar, and that's why we refer to SCIF as our community solar, because it's designed to be in the same vein as community solar generally. We certainly talk to our counterparts in other states, particularly in the Northeast, Massachusetts, and there are different aspects of the SCIF program that I would say those states are looking to us for in terms of how we award the subscriber credits, and distribute the benefits to the low-income populations, and avoid some of the pitfalls that can come with aggressive tactics to enroll customers into SCIF. So I think that there are some aspects of our program that other states are looking to us for. Whether the program itself is as successful as other states' community solar, Josh touched on in his remarks earlier, which is one of the unfortunate things about this is that it launched right before the pandemic. And we've experienced some attrition that I think is attributable to that. And I'm going to stop and let Josh finish this answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that last point. Not only the pandemic, but then of course, inflation after that has made it very difficult for projects that submitted bids, not knowing that those things were going to occur. I will say what's encouraging to me is actually we haven't seen a ton of attrition yet. We just ran up against there's all projects that are selected after PURA approval, you have 3 years to deploy, and unless you meet some additional criteria, which we just approved this last year. And so we're hopeful that that we'll see projects from the first year start to be deployed in the next couple of years. So I think it's a little bit too early to say whether or not the deployment part is successful. I will say that the prices that are being paid is significantly lower than what our counterparts with similar programs are seeing. So that's a potential benefit if those projects are able to be move forward. And then the last thing I'll say to start where the chairman or to end where the chairman started rather was really when we were looking around at different jurisdictions in 2019 after DEEP submitted their initial proposal to us. We really heard from a lot of other jurisdictions that having difficulty marrying a community solar program up with a focus on low-income customers. A lot of those programs really focus on getting an upfront contribution from stakeholders, going door to door, which of course then raises consumer protection concerns and other things that you'd have to work through. And particularly if your aim is to give low-income customers savings, asking for money upfront from them can be very difficult.
Just following up on that, is that a system design tweak we might consider, or are there ways that we could look at minimizing the upfront costs for low-income households?
I think what you're hearing from us is that our program was designed to incorporate that lesson learned from day one. And it's one of the few benefits of going later than your colleagues is that you're able to reflect those types of lessons learned in the design of the program.
Great, thank you. I have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize, and we're protective of your need to be elsewhere fairly shortly. Other questions? Representative Mika.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a real quick question. I know you have to go to the other hearing, but and thank you for the presentation. I presume this is going to be available on your website or the committee's website, or?
CTN is following it, so
Okay.
it can be recorded.
We will
Okay.
provide a copy to your clerk since there are hyperlinks in the
That's
decision.
good information there, so I appreciate it. So just to put this into context, for several years, my colleagues have lamented the fact that we're way behind Massachusetts, for example, since you mentioned other states, our neighbor to the north. Are we still way behind Massachusetts? And if so, what is the reason for that? And if not, I'm happy, but I suspect you're going to give a different answer.
Sure. I think, and you've heard this from me in other contexts, my first question when I hear comparisons like that is always like, what metrics are we using? Because now that we have 2 years under our belt of data from the successor programs, we can start to compare it on different types of metrics on a per capita basis, for example. And Josh is better with these comparisons than I am, so I'll let him supplement. But I think what we're seeing is that we're on par with other New England states on some metrics. And then if you're evaluating it on a different lens, then we might be behind. So it really depends on what your primary objective is in terms of how you're comparing it.
Yeah, and I would just point you to there's a portion of our clean energy report that actually has a comparison against other Northeast states, and it shows our ranks in terms of megawatts, but then more, in my opinion, more importantly, on a per capita basis.
I'll just one quick follow-up. Where do these caps come into play with regards to that the comparison?
Sure. So when we are able to supplement and tell you how binding the caps are or have been on the non-residential portion, I think we can better answer that question. I think a more complete assessment of it might look at what the costs of the program are compared to the deployment numbers, and whether we're achieving on a on par ratepayer impact to the other states. But we can reframe that question once we complete the data for the bindingness.
And the only thing I'd add just real quickly, and it's important to not only compare to our neighbor jurisdictions, but also to assess how we're doing to assess how we are doing in meeting our goal of 100% zero carbon by 2040. And how we're doing compared to our neighbors might not actually be the same thing. So I just wanted to flag that for your consideration.
Other questions? If not, again, thank you for setting the stage for us so effectively today. I will look forward to attending your annual report meeting next week, and I imagine we'll lots of.
Chair, I did have a question.
Oh, I didn't see you. That looks like Representative Meskers, though. You had a different.
Yes, it is. The link. I couldn't find the link. I had to get someone else's link.
Well, as long as it works, go ahead, Representative.
So the segue into the 2040 zero carbon probably is my entry point on the analysis. So I'm concerned within our goals for zero carbon that ultimately we're going to drive ourselves to what I affectionately refer to as offshore purchases of clean energy. And on offshore, I'm very parochial, anything outside of the borders of the state of Connecticut. So I'm hoping that within the construct and the constraints on our solar programs, that we figure out how we value the fostering of and purchase and or the creation of solar energy within the state versus the purchase from out of state. I think if we can get to hydroelectric out of Quebec, I don't expect there's a competitive reason why we wouldn't want to do that given the cost structure. But to buy other types of solar energy or green energy, I'd like to make sure that our programs and the subsidies for growing the business and the structure in state are in place. So I hope there's going to be some weighted valuation when you do the analysis of getting to 2040 in the cost of solar.
Representative, that to a large degree is up to both the legislature and DEEP to make those priorities. Does Pure have any comments with regard to that?
I would thank the representative for his comments and note that from Pure's perspective, the programs that we oversee behind the meter are necessarily located within Connecticut, as one of the eligibility requirements is that they must be located in either the Eversource or the UI service territory. So certainly Connecticut ratepayers are benefiting from the resilience that comes for the grid of locally sited generation, not just the benefits that accrue to the individual non-residential residential customer who has the solar on their site, but also the benefits that come to other ratepayers. And it's definitely a component of our evaluation when we're looking at the objective to balance participant and non-participant costs. There are actually types of cost effectiveness tests that you can do that look at what the cost to a participating customer is versus a non-participating customer. And we undertake those evaluations for all of our grid modernization programs to ensure that the benefits to non-participating customers are equally considered.
Great. And just as a follow-up, so my concern is twofold. One, the investment that goes out of state in terms of purchasing our energy out of state. And I guess the second piece is in the local generation, the buildup of microgrids may lessen the cost, I'm assuming or hoping, on the distribution network if we begin to create local hubs of production, right? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
That's certainly in the theory. I would defer to our colleagues at DEEP who have a more comprehensive scope over the grid planning from a resource perspective. But I think ultimately from PURA's perspective, we defer to the committee, the legislature, DEEP and others for your judgment. The one thing that I will tease here for your benefit is PURA has undertaken our performance-based regulation dockets with a lot of vigor, I'll say, at the legislature's direction, stemming back to Public Act 20-5. One of the 3 tracks of our performance-based regulation docket is focused on integrated distribution system planning, another acronym for you, IDSP. And the theory behind this docket is that we are bringing all of our grid modernization programs under one umbrella and working with the EDCs to provide transparent outlooks into how they plan for the distribution grid and how they incorporate into those plans the contributions that come from solar programs, battery storage, and similar programs.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Are there any other questions? Last chance. That's right.
That's okay. I'm told it's
Give me permission to
recorded.
follow up at your leisure. Again, thank you for taking the time to get us off to a good start today. I do think this will lead very well into some of the points that will be brought up subsequently, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. And I look forward to hearing the panel's comments later today. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving to the next item of our agenda, which is a summary overview of solar incentives in surrounding states. So we'll get the context that we've been alluding to all along about how do we compare to other states, and is it important to us to be looking at other states and some of these things? So I will turn this over to Valessa Suter-Klein, who is the Northeast Regional Director of the Solar Energy Industry Association.
Excellent.
Good.
Thank you, Chair. And just checking my audio is good. Yes. Okay. Appreciate you holding this information session. That the opening presentation was incredibly helpful. As you noted, my name is Valessa Suter-Klein. I am the, oh, right, you guys don't have, all right. I'm the Northeast Regional Director for the Solar Energy Industries Association, better known as SEIA. SEIA is the National Trade Association for the solar and storage industries. We represent over 1,000 member companies across the country. And we sort of our defining mission is that we fight for policies that create jobs in every community and shape fair market rules for competition and growth of reliable and low cost solar power. And we've added storage to that mission as well. I always like to note wherever I am. So there's 165 companies based in Connecticut. And that doesn't include companies that are national companies that are also doing business in Connecticut as well. And that represents, I believe it's around 2,300 jobs presently. And just as an aside, so I mentioned that I cover the Northeast region, so that includes ostensibly all of New England and New York. Practically speaking, I spend much of my time in New York and Massachusetts because of their robust solar programs, but I am based in Mansfield, Connecticut. And so my remarks today are actually going to be quite short. There are 2 developers in the room that are going to provide detailed input on the various programs in Connecticut and sort of where we would like to see the industry go. I wanted to be present at this info session for a couple of reasons. One, I am more than happy and will speak a bit to the programs in both New York and Massachusetts. But 2, simply to have an opportunity as a representative of the National Trade Association to say, you know, my membership is increasingly interested in Connecticut, and there are real business opportunities here and real opportunities to bring additional emissions-free clean energy online. So I am transparently quite new to the Connecticut policy world and will be more present and digging in, and I really look forward to working with the committee as we move forward in Connecticut. So I will briefly touch on both New York and Massachusetts because I think they're interesting. I would add that, and I think Chair Gillette said this well, Connecticut is a fairly nimble state, and you all have done some things that other states haven't done. So it is always useful to look to other states and borrow from other states. But I also would say that Connecticut has, particularly around storage, shown leadership. And I think there are things that other states are looking in, and the chair mentioned this around the aspects of the SCEF program. But I think there are things that other states are looking to Connecticut for. So I think that there's an opportunity, like I said, to just charge forward here and really build out. So one of the main things we would like to see that was mentioned already is, there's the decarbonization by 2040 goal in the state, which is fantastic, but we would love to see interim targets, solar specific targets, to really benchmark and ensure that we are on track. One thing I will say that is true of all the Northeast states that I've looked at, but certainly New York and Massachusetts, is that both have decarbonization goals and both are lagging behind. Both saw some slowing down due to the pandemic and inflation and supply chain issues in the last couple of years. And so we are concerned about the pace of development of solar in the Northeast. And this is true here, this is true in New York, this is true in Massachusetts, but increasingly some of the low hanging fruit has already been developed. So it's going to get harder to develop solar, not easier. To some extent, there's going to be interconnection challenges and there will be siting challenges. So we expect to see that everywhere, and just want to make sure that's reflected in incentive programs and how they're built. So I don't have and I apologize, I wish I did. I don't have a presentation on the state of the New York Sun program in New York or the state of the SMART program in New York, but I can just briefly mention both because I think there are aspects of those programs that have been incredibly successful and are worth incorporating into the RRES program specifically and SCEF as well. I'm not going to speak as much to the residential market because Kyle will. But we represent all sectors of the industry from residential to utility scale and strongly feel that to meet any climate targets and realize our emissions reductions goals, we need all of the above approach to solar development. So with regards to the New York Sun program, which is New York's incentive program for solar, it's a declining block program. It includes incentives for certain adders around, say, brownfields and sort of driving where you want to see development go. In New York, what is unique and interesting is that it was also paired with a value of DER tariff. And so I think that is worth noting that New York has I was around at the New York Trade Association back at the beginning of VETR, slogging through setting those values and how do you actually assign numbers to, the energy value, the capacity value, the environmental value, the demand reduction, and the locational system relief value that is inherent in DERs. So, I think that's a consideration here. A lot of the conversation is around sort of cost shift and concern, but I think that it's important that Connecticut value what solar brings to the grid and to residents of the state. The New York Sun program has been, we always, there's two things that we look for in every single program, and it's consistency and predictability and sort of, no starts and stops. So that would be my one takeaway when considering both NRES and SCEF is we need sort of longer runways and more predictability within those programs in order to see robust development would be my consideration. And then the SMART program in New York, which they win for acronyms, in Massachusetts, they win for acronyms for sure. But the SMART program is particularly interesting because that kicked off, it was enacted before this, but it kicked off in 2018 and is now undergoing a full review. And so Massachusetts is reevaluating the costs or the values baked into their program. They're really looking at the adders that are in there. They're not seeing, for example, the parking canopy adder deployment that they wanted to see. So they're revisiting that and adjusting. Presumably they will adjust. They haven't yet. The amounts that are in there to drive development where they want to see it. And so that conversation is taking place right now. So that, you know, they saw an incredible increase in development with the SMART program. It was very, very successful, but sort of where does it go now is the question. And that's active in Massachusetts. And then they're also there, I would say, you know, there's starting to be conversations around a value of solar process or proceeding. So nothing in place yet, but again, that's a very sort of important part of the conversation. So like I said, I want to keep my remarks brief. I think you want to hear from developers. They have all the information, but I did want to share that with the committee.
Thank you for sharing with us. You know, we heard earlier about the importance of having appropriate metrics for measuring success, and you brought up the VDER as something that a lot of states are looking at. But my impression is there's not necessarily a uniform approach to VDER. In fact, I would say, I'll choose my words carefully, that Connecticut has struggled to come up with an adequate means. And if we're going to develop a strategy for the state, how important it is for us to really get a focus on that moving forward.
I wouldn't say it would be a priority. I think what's important when looking at an incentive program like SCAF or NRES is just fully valuing the technology and what it brings to the state and ensuring that you're setting those incentive rates or incentive amounts at a point that will ensure deployment.
We just do a quick follow-up and I'll hand off to others. Sort of a counterpoint. There are those here in Connecticut who believe, given the challenges we're going to face for the next decade or more with regard to supply due to the retarded development of offshore wind, for example, that we will have some days in which supply and demand will be very tight. Can we realistically plan for our future without an apples to apples valuation of value if we're going to contemplate, and I'm not sure there's not much interest in this, but expanding of natural gas pipelines or other alternatives? How do we make those pros and cons decisions, taking into account exogenous factors and supply chain and permitting and that, without having an effective VDER analysis?
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it makes the conversation easier and it makes it much more transparent, sort of what the value of solar is. Like it is what it says it is. And I think that's helpful. And I'll let the others panelists also speak to this.
Thank you. Other questions? Then I guess we can move right along. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Steinberg, Chairman Needleman, other ranking members and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. My name is Jeff Masel. I am a co-founder and managing director of Lodestar Energy, a solar and energy storage developer located right here in Hartford County in Avon. Over the past decade, we have developed over 150 megawatts of solar and energy storage in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York State. We have a unique perspective in that not only have we developed those assets, but we own and operate the vast majority of those. So we participate these assets in the programs. Connecticut has a rich history here. We've participated in the programs established by Public Act 1180, Public Act 1935, and most recently, we are participating in Chair Gillette and Director Ryer's programs referenced the SCEF and NRES programs. We're excited to give our perspective on the comparative analyses of these programs since we live them every day. We most importantly want to contextualize Connecticut in that framework and share our perspective of what we view as best practices. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Oliver Sandreuter, who's going to walk through really what we think are best practices and how we view those states. Oliver comes to us as a former policy and participant in national and regional political campaigns. He's now Lodestar's Director of Policy, and let me hand it over to him so he can walk through our agenda and the specifics on the programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much to the members of the committee. I just want to put up on the screen here a slide that's going to highlight some of what we've heard so far from Chair Gillette, Director Ryer, our colleagues at SIA, in terms of this snapshot between Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut, particularly in the three domains that I think from the developer's perspective are incredibly important for us. First being rate and rate design. The second then being the program, the programmatic structure at large when we're looking at it from a developer's perspective. And then finally, deployment and the goals, obviously, of getting steel in the ground and getting projects deployed. So looking first at Massachusetts, that is the SMART program right now. A key component of the SMART program from a rate structure is that it provides a fixed floor. So why is that important? For us as project developers, we need to have certainty in what rate we are going to be building our projects towards so that we can then finance our projects and move forward with confidence that that will be a successful project. And so that we do not leave stranded megawatts on the table. The Massachusetts SMART program also allows for an index to the market. So although you have your rate floor, your project can also participate through net metering and benefit from rates that go up. And if you are being tied to that market, that obviously allows upside for a project with, most importantly, that floor, which all generate a clear price signal for us as a developer. We know what we need to reach. We know what we need to build to get there. And we can move forward into that program with confidence. In New York, a bit of a different way to get to ultimately the same outcome. And within VEDR, you've heard mention of VEDR, the value of distributed energy resources rate. That provides your core rate within New York. It does move a little bit more. It fluctuates. It's designed to track the market and designed, as Valessa mentioned, to capture the true value of a solar project. And the complexities behind VEDR are significant to create, but once you have VEDR in place, it allows both the state and the developers to predict that rate and move forward again with confidence in a price signal, which is, again, if you can't tell the common theme for us, that's what we're looking for. And now in Connecticut, when we look at the SCEF and the NRES programs, we see a bit of an inversion of these concepts. The rate is going to be fixed at a ceiling, right? So we have price caps in those programs. Once you've bid your project in and you've been awarded your rate, that remains constant. It will not be indexed to the market. It will not grow. If market conditions change and become more challenging, you will be faced with the decision to either not move forward with your project at all or to try to weather that storm and wait out until more favorable conditions arise. And this is what kind of ends up generating a limited and lagging price signal. I'm not going to say there's no price signal, but for us as a developer, we have one window a year to go bid our projects into the solicitation. We're going to be bidding in blind, so we know the ceiling, but we don't know where that clearing price will be. And there'll be no true up to wherever the highest bid that was selected is. So that makes a pretty difficult environment for us as a developer. We can obviously look at years prior and look at where the clearing price was for those years, but we ultimately don't quite know what rate we're going to get until we are awarded it, which creates an incentive for us as a developer to go after that rate as quick as we can and to get in line first. And this is going to be now moving into the program structure. And you'll see this again come up, this idea of first in line versus first ready. In Massachusetts, the sheer scope of the program is much larger. The SMART program is about a 3.2 gigawatt goal. It's about 3,200 megawatts. They have a declining block structure. So again, that rate floor will gradually compress and get a little tighter as the years go on. As Valessa mentioned, the state is in the process of reevaluating that now after an incredibly successful run of deployment. They then create adders and subtractors to that rate to incentivize or disincentivize good and bad behavior. So you can think of servicing LMI customers or pollinator adders, and then subtractors for greenfield development or things that you otherwise might want to disincentivize. In New York, the goals in New York are quite large as well, about 10 gigawatts at the moment. The New York Sun program is, as Valesa mentioned, layered on top of VETR to provide an upfront incentive on a dollar per watt basis, and similarly is a declining block structure. So as a developer, we can look at those blocks, we know what the incentives are, we know what numbers we need to get to. Finally, in Connecticut, the aggregate megawatt goals are much lower. SCEF and NRES combined have caps on the megawatts deployed in addition to the price itself, and functions more as bid discounts. So the good behavior that you want to incentivize comes into play as a bid preference, so to drive prices further down in the blind auction. So again, just wanted to say how that creates this first in line idea where, as a developer in Connecticut, we are going to try to bid our project as optimistically as possible, as aggressively as possible, because we do not know where the price will clear, and we want to make sure that we have a bid to then begin developing our project off of. Whereas in Massachusetts and New York, we know what rate we need to get to, and we need to have a much more mature project. It needs to be fully permitted. Our interconnection needs to be locked up before we go and get those incentives. So by the time we are approaching those incentive programs, our project is just about fully baked. Whereas in Connecticut, it's very speculative when we are going after that bid. The last line here is quite simple. This is data from our colleagues at SEIA, so thank them for that. In Massachusetts, successful deployment of about 4.3 gigawatts of solar. New York, around 4.9. I think it's a little higher now as well. And in Connecticut, about 1.3. So, significantly lower on a per capita basis, not incredibly bad, but Representative D'Amico, to answer your earlier question, we are behind. And more importantly, where are we going to be going? And what rate will we continue to deploy resources? Just to summarize that snapshot, I want to pull out a few clear best practices from the developer's perspective. The first and most important being a clear market signal and a price that's indexed to the market. We need to be able to look at a program and know what rate we can build towards, which then allows you to get to the second best practice, which is an uncapped program that is based around a first ready versus first in line concept. We as developers are more than happy to pour significant investment into our projects if we know where the goalposts are going to be by the time we get out of that permitting process. In line with that is the third best practice, which is consistent programmatic requirements. We've heard throughout both previous presentations the need for predictability and a timeline that we can build upon. That's very important for us within the NRES and SCEF programs. There's an annual review process, as our colleagues at PURA mentioned, that sometimes significantly change the program, which makes it even more difficult for the developers. And the final best practice here is a third-party administrator. From developing in Massachusetts, New York, and other states, we feel that both the EDCs and the developer community benefit from having a third-party administrator helping move the logistics of the program along, and just helping increase efficiency there. So that's the high-level best practices and comparison between the states. I'm going to now hand it back to Jeff here to make additional case for the investment in the DER sector at large.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. So the strength of the DER investment is significant. Looking at Connecticut's renewable goals, we've got a 40% RPS by 2030 and 100% carbon neutral by 2040. This isn't a question of if, it's a question of how. And as we've heard, we have some significant slowdown in some of the offshore wind resources. We have some challenges meeting those goals. What we really think is a compelling thing for solar is looking at the economic development that it generates and the employment opportunities that it creates for generating jobs and investment opportunities in the state. The dollars invested, Connecticut to date has $3.4 billion invested for its renewable generations for the past 14 years. Those include all programs. By contrast, Massachusetts has $10 billion for a shorter period of time. Connecticut was early to this game and got in early with some of its incentives. So we see 10 billion invested over that time. And if we look at what Director Ryer was talking about per capita, Connecticut is more than 50% of the population of Massachusetts. So to level set these, that's a $7 billion investment versus a 10 billion over a longer duration. So we're lagging. It's a good metric. We should spend more time delving into the specifics year by year and program by program. But this gives us a snapshot of the past 14 years in Connecticut versus roughly the last 10 years in Massachusetts. The jobs created, by contrast, again, the same time period and same metrics, 2,300 jobs created over that 14-year period versus 11,000 in Massachusetts and New York. These are significant benefits that we should take into consideration and think about how best to benefit Connecticut. And last but not least, there were some questions about how's the grid going to handle this? What's our energy future going to look like when we have more intense storms, when we have questions about reliability and essentially the consistency of the grid. The local upgrades by distributed resource create islands of power, pockets of power that can be segmented off grid and enable towns to stay online even when the transmission infrastructure goes down. These upgrades and the resiliency that they add are compelling features as well of having more distributed generation in the state. And last but not least, the energy savings offered to individual participants in the programs, whether they're municipal, community solar participants, low-income participants. One of the lacking qualities of Connecticut's quote community program, Connecticut style community program, and SCEF is your inability to choose a third-party provider who comes in and sleeves that through. We heard Director Ryer mention there may be some consumer protection concerns there. We think those could easily be addressed through some safeguards that other states have employed in order to do that. And finally, one of the things we've heard about Connecticut's program, we hear it in each program when they consider these important but significant investments in their programs, is how do they get paid for? What are the features that enable these programs? And Director Ryer and Chair Gillette were also mentioning that there are some cost studies. DEEP has a study, PURA has a study about how they're paid for. In Connecticut, they're paid for by a ratepayer model. The evaluation of those costs is an important one. There is a RIM model right now, the ratepayer impact measurement that PURA currently employs. But we would suggest that maybe that ratepayer model needs to be looked at in the context of other states. These programs we looked at in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York are significantly larger than Connecticut's, and the impact model that they're using to measure their programs do not spell out the same kinds of costs that we are seeing in our Connecticut model. A comparative analysis of these models, we think, would yield a result that would be less impactful to ratepayers. So to state this another way, the costs that we're measuring right now are incorrectly being modeled as a cost to ratepayers. And if we can look at other states' models, I think it'll give us a context to understand how best to account for those in our methodology.
Well, let's just jump right in on that last point, because one could say we're very sensitive about ratepayers right now in the state of Connecticut. If there is a more practical framework we might use to predict and assess impact on ratepayers, are you suggesting that either New York or Massachusetts has a model that we might choose to emulate?
We think so. We'd like to defer to PURA. We think they're the experts in this realm, but we'd also like to employ those models and import those in. By way of example, we could show you right now the value of DERs on the grid. This slide demonstrates the last 4 years of SCEF bids have averaged 9.58 cents per kilowatt hour, also 95.8 cents per megawatt hour. That SCEF rate includes a generation, a capacity cost, a capacity reserve, and a REC. These things are all bundled and what is given back. This should be a neutral rate. In fact, we actually think there's a benefit here that's being passed on. If you run this through the ratepayer impact model, it tells a different story. So our suggestion, we are not experts in this rate paying, the rate making models, but having spoken to groups who do the analyses, we think that this is something that if we put a working group or really spend some time around this or engage Pura to do this work, we think we'd find a different outcome from that ratepayer impact measurement.
For that, and I strongly encourage you to submit or provide testimony to that very point, whether on Tuesday or subsequently. That could be very helpful, and as well on any thoughts you might have from your observations of other states with regard to consumer protections, because we also have a bill that relates to that. One more question before I hand off. You've heard Representative Meskers talk about doing what we can within the state of Connecticut. You yourself have presented some information related to the job opportunity here in the state. Is there something we ought to be talking about by way of change to encourage activity in the state that would, again, take advantage of best practices, as you put it, that we've seen from other states? We're a smaller state, we have our limits, but this is something we do want to encourage. And I get the sense from you that there is some upside that we have yet to take advantage of.
We completely agree. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed at the federal level to encourage some of the investment in renewable energy really has prioritized prevailing wage. Prevailing wage encourages groups who are building these projects, for instance, in Connecticut, to use the local labor pools to do that and pay the prevailing wage for that county. We think that encouraging more development in state to achieve Connecticut's goals will automatically do that because the IRA mandates really prevailing wage. Connecticut passed a series of bills last year. Those two require any project larger than 1 megawatt in size to use prevailing wage. So we think we've really done the lion's share of that work. It's really now encouraging more projects to be built in Connecticut to tap into the laws that this committee and the legislature did the good work of enacting last year.
I will do a quick follow-up. I have the temerity to ask, would this bring Lodestar back into Connecticut in a bigger way?
We would be buoyed by this and see a significant runway here in Connecticut. As you can imagine, we have really the obligation to look at the viability of our company and the profitability of our company. And when we see our neighboring states that might be as close as 30 minutes on one side or an hour on the other with more compelling opportunities, that can be attractive. But this kind of change would really, I think, keep us focused at home here.
Pretty good here. Other questions? Representative Cheeseman.
Thank you very much, Chair Steinberg. Could you go back to the preceding slide, please? Maybe before that, where it had current costs. Oh, yeah. What's the capacity factor of solar in both Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut?
So the capacity factor is generally about 20%. But
I'm just looking at Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, and they're saying 13.06%.
so the capacity factor is a different metric than the capacity cost and the capacity reserve. So if you took so it's a great question, and we're going to go down a rabbit hole on this one, but I'm happy to take you down.
Well, I don't know how far we want to go down the rabbit hole. I think what I'm looking at, and just having come from a discussion about how we keep our rates low, I'm looking at 9.5 cents. Currently pulling up the ISO, I see the current price is 2.4 cents. With a concern for, obviously, I get the job goals, I get everything else, but thinking about the ratepayers, particularly absent large-scale battery storage, we're paying an awful lot for not getting too much power. So now I'll let you go down the rabbit hole and explain to me why I've got the wrong end of the stick here.
Sure. So it's a good question. So we have an RPS. That RPS has what is a alternative compliance program, also alternative compliance payment, which any third-party supplier has to pay if they don't get their 40% of their energy from a renewable source. That alternative compliance payment is about 4 cents. So we offer what's called a REC. So you'll see on this slide, number 4 listed as REC. That REC would have to get added to what you're referring to right now is what's called a locational marginal price, that 3 cent range. So you add 3.5 cents to that, which is what the current cost of a REC is, and you're at 6.5 cents. The other component is the facilities we are building are not, when you buy power from a locational marginal, a node is what it's called, at that locational marginal price, those nodes are located in very few locations. You have to go get the power from that node and then now deliver it along lines to get it somewhere else. So there's a transmission charge after that. Those transmission and distribution charges, I mean, I don't know how closely you read your utility bill at home, but it's 14 cents here in Connecticut.
Yeah, I know. You're talking to someone who not only reads her utility bill, but has served on this committee. I'm now in my 8th year. So
Okay. I'm going to give you a statistic. The average consumer in the US spends 6 minutes a year reading their utility bill. So that's a benchmark.
yeah, no, I accept that. But we are talking to a different audience here.
And I'm glad to hear that because obviously that's an important part of this. But again, this is, I think, more in Pure's domain. I am happy to go through this, but the analyses and the value of distributed energy that New York has performed, Massachusetts has performed. We saw a draft one here in Connecticut in 2020, which was a lengthy report. Those all point to an energy value of what solar generates on the grid, really more in the 10 to 14 cent range. So that's the benefit that we see to the state. So anything in that range would be neutral to the ratepayer if the accounting methodology matches what that VEDA rate says.
So if we can figure out a way to cook the numbers, the ratepayers are going to feel better. I'm sorry, I'm not meaning to be flippant here, but 10 to 14 cents given, anyway. Thank you for the information. This is a discussion that we will continue to have on this committee. And I absolutely accept that under certain circumstances, solar is fabulous. I'm just not convinced in states like New England, it's the answer to our problems. And I want to thank you, Chairman Steinberg, for indulging me.
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman, for bringing up an issue we will discuss quite a bit going forward. And I think it underscores the importance of making a distinction between VDER valuations and picking an arbitrary number. And ultimately, to your point, it comes down to ratepayer rates. But there are many other considerations that if we want to have a real level playing field comparison as compared to other generation sources, we need to have that kind of effective data. And we're not there yet, which leaves us open to all sorts of speculation.
Sure. And more information is always better if we are going to make decisions in the best interest of the state, the ratepayers, and the environment. So thank you.
Here, Representative. Senator Fazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to commend your bravery for pointing out in this building that prevailing wage raises costs. So, going back, the SCEF program, 9.5 cents is your calculation, the current rates. Do you have data on what you think average rate or the metrics or the numbers are for NRES? Pretty new program, but.
So we do, and in fact, I think Director Ryer was running through that on his presentation. We did not do that analysis for this. We just thought this was since SCEF is the most mature program, this gave us the biggest data set. It gave us 4 years, whereas that NRES data is relatively short. It's 2 years of data right now. So
Did the previous presentation include NRES data or?
It did. And so that is available, and we can get you a copy of that.
And does anyone remember what it was? Because I wasn't here. Beg your pardon. No, okay.
So there's 3 buckets in it. There's kind of the small, medium, and large.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get different clearing prices for each one.
Yeah. But presumably the NRES is higher than SCEF and the RRES is higher than the NRES.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
But those are kind of there's a bidding system, an auction system, and it's going to be kind of a fixed price over time is basically the right way to interpret those programs.
So, maybe I'll let Oliver address this one about the cap and generally the way that
Sure.
that plays out.
Yes. So essentially, yeah, there's an annual solicitation where developers will bid their project at a rate. If they are selected, that rate will be fixed for a 20-year tariff. However, though, to your point about the future of the rate, every year moving forward, there's no certainty as to what the clearing price for the next year will be.
So for new auctions.
Correct. Which from our perspective, we are not in the business of saying what that rate should be, but we will say that it helps us significantly if we can know what the rate will be, because then we can build and plan projects accordingly.
And so, before I follow on that question, but if you bid for your first project it's going to be what you get at the auction for 20 years.
Correct.
Okay. And then
Correct. Yeah, that
Cool.
project will secure that bid rate for a 20-year tariff, and the project will have secured that bid in Connecticut very typically at a very early stage in development. So the project has not gone through significant civil engineering work yet. It has not gone through the interconnection process yet. It has not typically gone through the permitting process. So all of those things will typically yield red flags or things that will change the design. And so you end up with a project that bid at a certain rate, and then 2 or 3 years later, the project may look significantly different. And because of the nature of the blind bidding and the need to be competitive, you are bidding in a most optimistic scenario. And then by the time you get through the development, you are typically less than the full amount of optimism you may have once had 2 or 3 years prior.
Well, I think Lodestar is a great developer. I'm sure they would never end up with a less optimistic.
Thankfully, we
cost
have
outcome.
not. However, in the SCEF program, the question came up earlier, how many of those SCEF year one projects have been built? To the best of my knowledge, the answer is 0 right now. Lodestar has probably the first 2 SCEF projects that will get built. However, those projects were, let's call them our crown jewels. We got a little lucky with those projects, and there is, I think, a very real risk of stranded projects
So
across
the
the programs.
everything else in SCEF they were already built, projects that were already built, and then they started bidding into the.
No SCEF projects have been built. So the year one projects that bid into SCEF have not
okay.
been built yet.
Got it, 'cause they
everything
they
in
bid into
Connecticut
it
in the
before
ground
they get
now,
built.
correct, is
Got it.
from programs previous to SCEF and NRES.
Okay. And so you mentioned that in Connecticut, we have you said it was disadvantageous, the pricing. But you also mentioned that the other states do an index. I assume it's an index relative to whatever the NYISO or New England ISO prices are, plus.
Correct. Yeah, they generally are responsive to the market. And so VDER, as the Value Distributed Energy Resources in New York, does get updated. The various parts of the VDER stack are updated on different cadences. And then in Massachusetts, the rate that you win in your base block is your financing floor. And then you can be indexed above that floor depending on market conditions.
Do you know roughly where the floor is and where the index is for those 2 states?
Great question. It significantly depends on what part of the state you're building in. Massachusetts and New York have different load zones, different utilities. I'll say the average VDER rate in New York for upstate is around 10 to 11 cents. And then it can be, you may build in a project that has a locational system relief value added if you are building in an area that the state has determined needs more energy than others. So you can go down many rabbit holes in terms of where the best space to put a project is. But yeah, the average VDER rate, I would say, is around 10 to 11 cents.
Okay. And can you explain first in line versus first ready? I wasn't totally
absolutely.
following your recommendations and opinions there, or what they are.
Absolutely. And my apologies for being maybe a little in the weeds on it. But the general concept is that when you go to approach the state's program, how mature is your project? So how much have you invested in your project already? Have you done all the engineering? Have you done your interconnection? Have you permitted the project? That would be the first ready example. Means that I have invested my full package into the project. I'm ready to build. Now I go to the incentive program. I get my spot. I say, here's my project. Here's what it looks like. And I'm rewarded the incentive or the value of energy, whatever it is in that state. In Connecticut, though, the first in line concept means you are running to get in line first. It doesn't quite matter how ready or mature your project may be. And you can obviously increase the thresholds of readiness, and that is generally what we would be open to. However, to have a higher threshold of readiness, a project needs to have a higher threshold of certainty as to what rate it will eventually get.
Great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the indulgence.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to do a quick follow-up. I can't resist the temptation. Recognizing how much work it took for us to create a new framework, which is SCEF and the RES programs, and how we don't necessarily want to go through that again anytime soon, not only for our own benefit, but to have the predictability that the industry is looking for. Do you believe we can tweak the current framework to take into account some of the things, for example, New York takes into account for VDER, or maybe some of the considerations, not having a pure first to bid as opposed to something that recognizes the solidity of the project? Could we work with that? Or would you say that we really need to abandon a paradigm which is predicated on caps as opposed to what is going on in New York and Massachusetts?
I would like to improvise a little here, and I'm going to make Oliver follow up my thoughts. So this is going to be interesting to see. I think you could create a base rate within the existing programs that you think is a fair assessment of the no adders, no subtractors, and it would work in the current framework. Once you do that, you could have adjustments up, which would be incentives for, say, low income, or for canopies, or for a different aspect that we would like to incentivize. And then you could create disincentives like Massachusetts does with the Greenfield, to say, if you're building on, farmland, if you're building on in a place we don't want you to build, there's a disincentive. So an economic deterrent. And I think that would be a kind of a good starting point. I'd like you to offer additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that there are absolutely ways to make improvements to the existing framework of both the SCEF and NRES programs using some of the best practices that we mentioned. I think those are certainly achievable and would make a huge impact for increasing the deployment and likelihood of success of renewable projects in Connecticut. I do think that there is opportunity to utilize those best practices, as well as lessons learned from programs that are currently sunsetting after incredible runs of success in the states around us, to develop an innovative and new program that would be inclusive of the best practices that we've mentioned, as well as the components of SCEF and NRES that have been working very well. So I think there's certainly a route to do both. And given the immediacy of SCEF sunsetting very soon, I think the ultimate priority from our perspective would be speed, and to find a way to make those changes such that we can continue to hopefully put steel in the ground and keep projects here.
Thank you for that nuanced response. As you may be aware, we are very open-minded about the future of the programs we put in place. We're talking about bringing SCEF and NRES into alignment in terms of the number of years. But I think many of us would like to believe we could work within the existing framework and work on process and some of the incentives, as you put it, and work within that program to make it even more effective. So we appreciate your input and look forward to your ongoing insight into how we might move forward. Are there other questions? Yes, Representative Piscopo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. Just a simple question, Jeff. You had a slide up with comparison slide with the other states, and the bottom of that slide was deployment. How can you help me just better understand the numbers on the deployment?
Yep. So these are all through SEIA. So we have the Solar and Energy Industry Association to thank for this. This is a combination of, prior to SMART, there were two other programs in Massachusetts. There was the SREC 1 program, under which about 800 megawatts was deployed. There was the SREC 2 program, which was about 1,600 megawatts. And then there's SMART, which has not been fully deployed. So when you see that 4,300 number, you're seeing 2,400, which was deployed under SREC 1 and on SREC 2, and about, I got to do the math, 24 to 900 megawatts that have been deployed under SMART. And we still have another runway of 2,300 to go in Massachusetts. In New York, there's a 10,000 megawatt program that they aspire to deploy over the next decade, by 2030. And so far to date, including all residential, commercial, they've deployed 4,900 megawatts. And we, in fact, SIA's slides, which we could get you links to as well afterwards, estimate New York's going to deploy another 8,000 plus megawatts. And Massachusetts, I can't remember the actual figures, but they're all significant. Connecticut's slide, I will tell you, we internally we wrestled with this one because we could only identify 900 megawatts that had been deployed. So we trust that SIA, who pulls this information from a variety of sources, I would defer to SIA and Pura on these two items, because I think Pura will tell you it's probably a different, they're telling you a number approximately in the new programs of a couple hundred megawatts. I heard it today from Josh and Director Ryer. I think that this just represents since 2010, under all the programs, which include virtual net metering, all the residential programs, SCEF, NRES, RRES, and don't forget the deep procurements. Deep did some procurements for large scale, which you've got things like Gravel Pit Solar, which are 120 megawatts. You've got the 20 and 40 megawatt sites that were part of that deep procurement in 2016, and a secondary procurement, I think, that was done in 2018 or 19.
Thank you. That does help. And Valissa, it's good you stuck around. Thank you very much. You have a tough job being the Northeast coordinator of the solar industry, because we're off probably apropos to the Northwest person that's your counterpart, but we're all forest. You know, and you talked about capacity, and Jeff mentioned capacity also. Our hands are somewhat tied in that we don't want to be clearing our forest or damaging our ridge lines and that kind of aesthetic and environmental damage to expand our capacity. So it's not like Arizona, your counterpart in the Southwest, where it's just fields of cinder or desert, and be much easier. I guess my question from a 30,000 foot level would be, when is it and Jeff's talked about incentives and disincentives, isn't it? And then one of your first slides, Jeff, was an array of solar panels on farmland. It looked like farmland. And when is it a disincentive and an incentive to, I guess, do it without being political? I mean, are you running into those roadblocks?
Yes, this is a topic I spend a lot of time discussing with member companies. I will say, so it is very interesting working Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. So New York has a lot of agricultural land. And so the conversation there is all around every one of these projects has a decommissioning bond, and it's making sure it's bonded and it can be taken out when it reaches the end of its useful life, unless you want to repower it. And is that land then available for agricultural use in the future? And generally speaking, I'm strongly of the opinion that having a solar array on agricultural land, which helps farmers sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of mitigate fluctuating prices for crops and other things and risk, and is meaningful to farmers, is a much better outcome than, say, selling to a residential development where that land is into residential use and gone. So the agricultural conversation is super interesting, and you have both Massachusetts and New York really looking at dual use agrivoltaics type programs, and how do you work with farming under or around or with solar. So that's a very active conversation and very interesting. So I would, you could certainly look at an adder for that, as opposed to, Connecticut has a core forest law. There's a lot of conversation about trees generally. And there's a lot that goes into that, so that you can bookend it on both ends of the spectrum. You can do a full life cycle assessment of solar power versus fossil fuels. And a few labs have done that, and you come out slightly in favor of solar. But I think, there's a lot of us in solar who actually care very deeply about the environment, and we're here to address climate change. So is there sort of some element of core forest that it doesn't make sense to plop a solar array down in the middle of an old growth forest, but privately owned land on the edge of a wooded area that's going to be a Dollar General, by all means, let's put solar there. So I think it is a very dynamic conversation, and one that I think it's important to have in a nuanced way, rather than you can't touch a tree. But how do we do this in a way that makes sense for the industry and that ensures that we're getting the climate benefits that we need in order to preserve the environment that we're trying to protect?
Thank you for that answer. And I would just ask you, maybe if I could get that document that compares the solar to natural gas facility or something like that.
Oh, yeah, that's not a SIA document. I can see if I can find a life cycle assessment. There's a couple out there. They're messy things. But yes, people have tried to do them because of this reality that we're not comparing completely undeveloped land. We're dealing with fossils versus solar, not pristine versus solar kind of thing. So
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yeah, we're never going to stop talking about trees because we have a lot of trees in the state. Any other questions? If not, I know that Kyle's been waiting very patiently. We're down to about 20 minutes to go. Kyle Wallace, the VP of Public Policy and Government Affairs at PosiGen. The remainder of the time is yours.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Steinberg and Chairman Needleman and members of the committee. Let me share this presentation. All right. So I'm going to make my comments in three sections. The first is going to be some commentary on the RES program more generally and responding to some of the items that Chair Gillette and Director Ryer brought up earlier. And then the second piece, I have a couple of slides on the surrounding states, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and how their markets have been developing over the last couple of years. And then I'll end with just a few thoughts and recommendations of where do we go from here on the residential side. And I think, the residential side, I think, is in a bit of a different space than maybe the NRES and SCEF, where I think generally the proof is in the numbers. The program has been successful. There are a lot of benefits to what Connecticut is doing that other states are not. And as I go through some of those comparisons, I think that'll be very clear. But 2023 was a record year. 2024 hopefully will be another good year. I don't know if it'll quite be a record. Some of the application data for RES did tail off a little bit at the end of last year. And I'll talk about some of those headwinds of maybe why that may be the case. But even if it's not a record year, I think it can still be another good year. Why was 2023 such a good year? There's really kind of three different main factors, I'd say. One that's national, one that's regional, one that's local. The national factor is clearly the Inflation Reduction Act. The investment tax credit was set to step down. It was at 26% in 2022. It was going to go to 22% in 2023. IRA pushed that back up to 30 and extended the life. So there was a lot more business certainty and excitement in general, which allowed companies to continue their investment. The more regional was the utility rate volatility that we all saw. I think that was a big wake up call for a lot of folks of what is our tie to natural gas pricing and what that means on the wholesale markets. Price increases are one thing. Volatility is a whole nother one. When it jumps 50% or 25%, from one bill to the next, that is a challenge for anyone. So I think there was increased consumer demand because of those factors as well. And then in Connecticut, and I think this is one that maybe has flown under the radar and is underrated, is we did, for the first time from 2022 to 2023, we actually had program certainty and continuity. And I think that was incredibly important. If you think back ever since 2018, when kind of the first conversations of successor programs, 2018, 2019 was a series of, oh, we're going to move to this program. Maybe there's an interim. Oh, we actually have to extend RCIP. Oh, now we have to extend the date of net metering. And so that was difficult for businesses to say, we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years. So we're like, why would we continue to grow our business when we're not sure? And then 2020, pandemic hit, certainly had big impact. 2021 was the year we were designing the RES program, still uncertainty of how it would turn out ultimately. 2022, finally the RES program came on and had some growing pains with as all new programs do. And so from 2022 to 2023, it was the first year that there just really wasn't massive changes to the industry that we were facing. So I think it's really a factor of all three of those, why the deployment has hit the level that it has. You know, there are certainly headwinds that we've seen recently with interest rates that impacts, you know, a customer who is purchasing the system and owning it, that they're not getting a 2.99% interest rate anymore on that loan from their bank or a loan provider. It's, you know, 7-8%. It's significantly higher than it used to be. And that impacts third-party owned systems as well, because obviously we have debt as part of our cost of capital as well. And so there's impacts there. Equipment costs, inflation, supply chain constraints were very real over the past few years. Some of those have started to mitigate in terms of the cost of modules and inverters. But that was something that we have run into, and then inflation just more generally. So with the RRES program, I want to just talk a little bit about the flexibility of the netting option, the buy-all option. Director Ryer mentioned this earlier, the buy-all option being kind of a unique thing that Connecticut has done that really does create some interesting avenues when it comes to deployment among low and moderate income households and communities. And he mentioned that now there's this option where you can kind of take the credit worthiness of customers out of the equation. And that's very true. As a company that is focused on serving LMI communities, and I think one of probably the only companies that really has a meaningful buy-all focused product, you know, it's something that we've seen a lot of interest in and success. So early success, I'd say it's not a huge number of customers, but it really does change the dynamic when you can basically remove any risk of default, because now you're getting paid by the tariff, and either the customer is getting just an automatic bill credit from the program, or in some cases, how we have it set up where we make a payment to the customer every month. They don't pay us anything, we pay them. For 20 years, it's a fixed known value. There's no risk. You know, what lenders look at that revenue stream and say it's a tariff revenue stream from the utility. It is secure, and the customer has no default risk. It solves a lot of the problems when trying to serve LMI communities. So I think that's one underrated part of the program, and I think there's a lot of exciting ideas. How do you use this part of the program to serve renters? Because I think there are some real options there of how do you get an incentive for the landlord, and the buy-all tariff revenue makes it possible the way it's set up, where you can split the bill credit going to the tenant and payments to the landlord. And so there's probably some creative models that we're looking at that will hopefully kind of solve that problem so that we can grow who can benefit from this program. I also just wanted to note that on the RRES program and more generally, you know, I think with all the work that Pura has done, I think it's fair to say that they have been one of the more active, if not the most active, utility regulatory authority in the country. What they've done in the last 4 years is more than most commissions do in a decade. When you think of all of the programs and initiatives they've done with RRES, NRES, SCEF, the energy storage solutions, the innovative energy solutions, you know, incubator sandbox program, the non-wires alternatives, managed EV charging, performance-based rate making, cost sharing for interconnection upgrades, low-income discount rates, and on and on. That when I get to some of the other states, you'll see that some of those individual programs take years in other states to try to get right. And here Pura has run through a whole host of programs in just a few years. So I think that is a very important thing to keep in mind. Also, the RRES program is viable statewide, and I think that's very important. It makes sure that it works in UI, it works in Eversource, and there's mechanisms where they can modify it by the utility specific factors to make it viable for everyone, because that's not always the case in other states as well. You know, I also, you know, there are some drawbacks. The program is complex, more complex than just a standard net metering program that may be in another state. But I think overall, when you balance the program objectives, the costs, the complexity, I think overall it comes out as a benefit for the program, even though it is challenging. It keeps us busy every single year in those annual review dockets, trying to you know, make sure that the program continues moving. It's a lot of work, but I do think it is a mechanism that allows for faster feedback and program changes than most other states allow. So I'll now shift to the regional comparisons, and I'll start with New York. And so in 2023, New York deployed 234 megawatts of residential solar, which was, they deployed of all solar 937 megawatts. So about a quarter of their deployment. One of the things that I need to note is that a lot of that deployment is not geographically even. It is centered in Long Island, it's centered in New York City and some of those suburbs in Con Edison territory. The rest of the state, the Hudson Valley, upstate, Western New York, they don't have the same level of residential solar adoption. Utility rates are lower. They don't really have programs that help address that. And so you don't see the same level of deployment. So it's kind of an unequal type of program. They do have net metering, and they did institute in 2022 a fixed charge based on the size of the solar system. It's a fairly modest charge, but it has increased a little bit over the last year or two. And that's kind of their current structure. They have additional incentives with the state tax credit, $5,000. It's non-refundable. So it's more of a benefit for higher income households, not as beneficial for low income who may not have the state tax liability to actually utilize that. And that importantly does go to the consumer in all cases, regardless of ownership of the system. On the storage program side, Long Island, the utility there has a storage incentive that they have up and running, but there is not a storage incentive for the rest of the state. And it's something that we've been struggling with in New York to get that up and running for several years. We're awaiting a statewide energy storage roadmap that is still not out. And one of the fundamental problems that they've had in developing a residential storage program that is utilizing those batteries for grid benefits is some regulatory inaction on addressing a concern of double compensation, where basically they prohibit residential batteries from participating in demand response programs, which is unlike the rest of New England. And it's nonsensical, but it is one of those barriers. So, and that's been in place for several years and still have not overcome it. So that's New York. Of solar, all sectors, 237 megawatts last year, which is not that much. I mean, Connecticut it will end up doing maybe more than that when the final numbers are in from 2023. The residential side was about half of that at 123 megawatts, which was a good year, but it was not. Most of the Northeast, when you look at New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and up, all the states except Massachusetts and Vermont had record years with residential solar. So what Connecticut saw was there were some unique factors, but regionally we saw a lot of deployment. They have retail net metering, but that it only applies to residential systems up to 10 kilowatts, and then it's slightly reduced for 10 to 25 kilowatts. A bill passed in 2022 that would increase that to 25, so it was full retail for 25 and under. Here we are a year and a half after that bill passed, and they still have not implemented that at the Regulatory Commission. So, and that is a simple change, it's changing from 10 to 25. So as I point out, the activity of Pura and its responsiveness to overcoming some of these challenges, I think that there's something that to be said of how important that is to have a regulator that is really trying to make these goals happen. As was mentioned by Valesa, the SMART program is currently being revamped because currently for residential projects, there is no value. It's zero, so no one participates, which is honestly not a good thing for the state because that means those renewable energy credits that are being produced may not be getting used for compliance. So part of why they may not be hitting their targets is they're not fully capturing the actual generation that is in state because of a flaw in their program that allowed the price of those RECs to go to zero without any backstop mechanism. And that's something we hope that they correct. And once again, this was something the industry identified in 2019, right after the program launched, and they still have not addressed it 5 years later. They do have some storage programs. Connected Solutions is obviously a strong storage program there. And then the Smart Energy Storage Adder, but that has become a lot smaller over time as well and is not as valuable. Rhode Island surprisingly did 40 megawatts last year, which for its size was on a per capita basis. I think it was one of the only states in the Northeast that did more than Connecticut. They did 226 megawatts overall, which is quite a bit, once again, for Rhode Island. Part of that is due to some lumpiness because of some utility scale projects that came online. That was about, I think, 120 or so of those megawatts. So it was about 120 utility scale, 40 residential, 60 non-residential. They also have a similar structure where they have net metering and a feed-in tariff buy-all type program like Connecticut. And those are options. They've recently increased that buy-all rate, and it's pretty similar to what Connecticut is at as well. So they have some of those incentives. And then they recently launched the Affordable Solar Access Pathways Program, which is an LMI focused solar program that Posgen is the participating contractor with the state for that. And so we're hopeful that that will drive further adoption for LMI communities. And then finally, New Jersey, they deployed 188 megawatts of residential solar, which was a record, as I mentioned earlier, which was close to 50% of their total deployment for the state. They have a large pipeline of community solar projects that are coming online, but it's just taking time to get them there. Utility scale has been difficult to build in New Jersey. They've had some unsuccessful procurements of utility scale projects. And so, like many other Northeastern states, trying to struggle to find that balance of solar programs, what works, what doesn't. They do still have a pretty solid incentive program, SREC 2, or the successor incentive program. They call it SUSI. I like SREC 2 better. And it provides a 15-year fixed rec on top of the net metering compensation. And there is a capacity limit by market segment, even for residential, which was controversial at the time, and we still don't like. It started at 150 megawatts a year. When the industry started to run into that early one year, it resets on June 1st of each year. The BPU reallocated more capacity so residential could continue to do projects because our cycle times are shorter. They're weeks or a month or two, not a couple years to build a project. And they recognize the need to maintain kind of an always-on program for residential to keep people working. So they have a cap, but it's never actually been hit because whenever it gets close, they find ways to continue the program, which I think kind of shows that a cap for residential is just not really a great idea. They also do not have a storage program that is currently in development. We're now in year 6 since a bill passed in 2018 telling them to create a storage program. Still has not happened. On top of that, there are also significant interconnection challenges, particularly in southern New Jersey, where they have had circuits that have been closed since 2016, 2017 that are still not open, where you can't even interconnect a residential solar system. They will not allow it. The utility there is now finally doing some investment that will upgrade those circuits. But once again, I think it shows that in some of these other states, these challenges persist. And PURA has tried to get ahead of that on the residential side with some interconnection cost sharing, and they're working on that on the non-residential side as well to make sure that circuits don't get closed in the first place, because it's really hard to cost share your way out of a closed circuit. Because if the circuit's closed, no projects are tried to build there, so there is no projects to share costs between. And so then at that point, it just really is utility investment or state investment to get those circuits open. So it's better to be proactive, come up with those cost sharing strategies so that you can make sure the developers are paying in, and it's not resulting in some of the problems we see in Massachusetts and New Jersey. So those are the 4 states. Happy to talk about some other states if that would be helpful. I will note Maryland has some legislation this year that is actually trying to make some changes to their low-income solar programs to be modeled off of basically what Connecticut has done with the kind of 2-tier approach of distressed municipalities and low-income customer incentives. And so we've kind of seen that elsewhere. Michigan had a bill introduced that was similar as well. So people are looking to Connecticut for these ideas, and I think that shows some of the work that is being done at PURA. So just a couple of recommendations now, as I think, as we consider the experience of other states. One of them is, and this was mentioned by Valesa, was a state target. I think that is something that we would like to see. We want to know, are we on track? Are we lagging behind? How does this play into with our electrification targets? You really need to have that fulsome analysis to know what do we need to be building, and how much are we relying on offshore wind? How much are we relying on nuclear or some other resource? And how much do we need from solar? If we're just kind of currently, it feels like we're kind of flying blind. Like we think we are making progress on certain areas, we may be falling behind in others, but until you have that kind of statewide targets and benchmarks, it's just not really clear. The other thing that the industry I think needs to work on, and another area where Connecticut has made some significant strides, is moving the residential market beyond just solar to a solar plus type market, where it's solar plus storage, it's solar plus EVs, it's solar plus smart appliances. And that's how you really get the virtual power plant type models, where you can utilize these assets as a combined resource. And while each individually, they may not be huge, combined, they can be pretty significant. And Pura, I think, has been doing a good job of trying to set the foundation to get the industry shifting, especially on the storage and EV side. And I think we are making progress. The Energy Storage Solutions program, I know it's not the main topic of today, but it's been a little bit of a slow start on the residential side, but I think we will see quite a bit more uptake this year due to some of the changes that have happened during the annual review process at Pura, where they saw the lack of uptake in the first year and second year, and now they've made some changes, and I think that will help address it. So that's kind of where I see the industry needing to move. And part of that is, as I mentioned earlier, the program continuity is really important. There's the end dates in statute of 2027 for the ROS program. And I think that should be a question of, do we need an end date for this program? Pura can make annual reviews. They can reduce compensation. They have reduced compensation going from 2023 to 2024. So the mechanism is in place to have a really nimble program. Do we need to end it and start something from scratch if it's working? So I think that is something that we would be interested in having that discussion. And then the final piece is cost reduction. I think that's long-term, where the industry really needs to spend a lot of time focusing on. How do we reduce our costs, both on the efficiency side? How can we make sure that, as you know, hopefully equipment costs will come down, especially on batteries, as we add more of those. But we also need to be focused on permitting, interconnection, and just some of those costs as well, which, you know, once again, each individual one, maybe not a huge part of projects, but every little bit that you can decline, the more cost competitive the resource is in the future. And so that's, I think, an area that, you know, maybe not so much on the legislative side, a lot of that is on us of making sure that we are doing what we can to improve that, things that, like, you know, pricing transparency for consumers. The more that there's real competition in the market and consumers are competing on that, and then or they're seeing the pricing, then that allows us to compete and try to lower and provide as much value as possible. So there's some things we can do there, but those are kind of my main recommendations. I think the residential program generally is done pretty well, and I think that there's a lot to be said for that.
Well, thank you, Kyle. You've covered a lot of ground today, and I particularly want to note your comments with regard to how much Pura has taken on and accomplished. I think we should really value the work product they put out on behalf of Connecticut. And thank you for also touching a couple other points we will be talking about this session, which are the costs and the strategy for interconnections. And we need to have more of a conversation about storage. How can we make the intermittency of solar and other renewable sources less of an issue without also making the rate impact even more problematic for consumers? I'm going to give the last word to Senator Fazio before we conclude today.
Well, I was actually going to follow on that point, and it's unfortunately more high level and philosophical about how to design the system. But, you know, obviously the intermittency creates a tax on the system. You know, when it's sun shining, you can plow cheap electricity into the grid, which is a good thing. But when it's not there, there's kind of a hole there, and the other producers, you know, are seeing lower rates because of the, you know, how it drives down rates at that time. So, you know, why shouldn't all these procurements and other programs tie solar or any other intermittent resource to battery deployment like together? You know, I know you guys are on the solar side, so maybe it's maybe you'd not love that necessarily, but you know, what's the reason not to do that?
Yeah, I mean, speaking from the residential side, I think part of that is we don't have enough batteries if we want to do every solar install with batteries. Also, as a company that's focused on low and moderate income homeowners, we don't underwrite to FICO or income, we underwrite to savings. So right now with the cost of storage, adding that to your solar system, you may be foregoing some of those near-term savings to add the storage, get the resiliency and some of those other benefits. And so that's at least for my company, that's the challenge that we face is we want to be able to provide these batteries with still providing solar savings. And we are piloting a project or a product here in Connecticut with a $10 a month battery lease we're retrofitting on existing solar customers that are low income qualified, participating in the Green Bank program. And so it's something that we want to move towards. Now, from a different installer perspective, that's not LMI focused. I think you are seeing that shift where they are trying to become solar plus storage as much as possible. And you're seeing that in markets like Hawaii, California, Puerto Rico. I think Puerto Rico, every solar system has battery. Hawaii, pretty much the same. California, not quite there, but the attachment rates have been driving up significantly. So it is something the industry is driving towards and understands we need to do. And I think it's a matter of, mandating versus setting the program so that the value streams and the revenue streams are there. And I think that's probably the better way to do it and let the market respond.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody who participated today and thank those who are watching from wherever they are. This has been really helpful in my view because, we are going to struggle to continue to push the initiative here in the state, given our other constraints. And we're going to have to be really thoughtful about how we make changes to the existing programs to optimize the benefits. So we will continue this conversation on Tuesday when we have our first public hearing, which will focus primarily on solar related issues. But I view this as a sort of an ongoing conversation that will take place beyond that as well. We have a lot of things to try. We want to strike a balance, and where that balance point is with the natural tensions between renewable energy and costs are yet to be determined. But it's been really helpful to understand what other states are doing, pro and con. I am all in favor of appropriate plagiarism, where we can take their well-tested ideas and apply them to Connecticut as appropriate. So I want to thank everybody who was involved in organizing today's efforts. They know who they are. And we will see you all on Tuesday.